by Simon Creek, with music from Stephen Merritt.
The book of love is long and boring. No one can lift the damn thing.
Sitting down to a supper of Indian takeout served on George's best dishes, Terence had a grand epiphany. Perhaps he was no longer Terence Owens, student to the owner of such prissy china, white with red flowers on the borders, and perhaps the china's owner, who read Dickens at the dinner table and misplaced the glasses that were on the top of his very head, was no longer George Stanton, teacher and tutor to Terence. Perhaps they were just people who picked pieces of chicken tikka masala off of one another's plates, although really that was only Terence, and delegated the washing up. This revelation was an encouragement, even serving, as it did, to magnify Terence's absolutely hopeless hopes. Terence was in the throes of his youth's grand passion, and it was only just, wasn't it, that at this time the object of his obsessive affection was unattainable. "Put down the damn book," he demanded. "You have a dinner guest." George extracted his surprisingly freckly nose from Pickwick Papers and peered myopically across the table. "I have?" he asked, blinking. "Where?" "Ha ha," Terence said. "Me, you ass. Pretty rude to pay attention to a book and not me, isn't it?" George slid his glasses down in order to glare at Terence over the tops of their lenses. "I," he proclaimed with great dignity, "am an English teacher." "Yes," Terence said, "but you aren't my English teacher." George waved a hand, closing the book all the same. "If you have anything interesting to say, by all means." He said that before, Terence thought, and the same china bore witness. The cousins of the same china, in all fairness. The tea service wasn't on the dinner table, which Terence thought must show remarkable restraint on George's tea-addicted part. It had still been autumn then. Terence had still been rash then. Somehow he had thought it would be a brilliant idea to accost George with confession over Earl Grey and rice cakes. "I love you, George," he had said, even though it hadn't even been a month since it was strictly Mr. Stanton. George hadn't said a thing for hours and hours, and finally gave Terence the gimlet stare that he deserved for nearly dropping his best china teacup. "I love you too," it had been that time. Only, protectively, paternally. Terence argued with what he supposed to be all the grand passion of frustrated love, and it was only while he walked back to his dormitory whistling at the stars that he realized George had not only rejected him, but cast him as his younger brother. Of all things. "One can never have too many brothers," Terence said, when really he wanted to leap across the coffee table and take advantage of every freckly inch of him. It was, overall, a craptacular situation. Although what chance he might have had with this simulated incest sort of thing would have been blown right away if he'd said craptacular in front of George. In any case, that time he had counted the flowers bordering the bone china cup. There were exactly 48. The vines joining the blooms possessed no leaves, and the fourth flower clockwise from the handle was smudged. Terence was quite intimately familiar with that teacup. His dinners with George had never become quite awkward enough to call for the counting of flowers on plates, but both knew that it was only a matter of time before Terence's inappropriate infatuation welled up once more and wreaked havoc on what they'd managed to construct. What they had managed to construct struck Terence as something approaching a little domestic life. He spent most evenings in George's Spartan schoolmaster apartment, top of the Ashwent, east side of the main hall, the two of them reading and marking papers variously. Mondays and Fridays, Terence brought takeout he'd bought on the way up to the school. George hadn't yet offered to pay for the meals, and in the spaces between his ribs, Terence fancied he could count them through tweed and linen and cotton, one encountered the logic behind his silence. He'd stopped taking the money Terence insisted was owed for tutoring a few weeks ago, claiming that reading by the fire that hardly counted as tutoring. Since the discovery of the nerve that ran right from his brain's auditory centers to some of his more excitable organs, Terence would have paid through the nose for reading by the fire with George, thanks very much, as long as he kept reading aloud. "How's Dickens?" he asked, eyes wide and innocent, as though he weren't begging for an excerpt to be read to him. "Very Dickensian," George said, his speech obviously third on the list of importance after reading he'd opened the damn book again and eating all of the chutney. Terence reached across the table for the condiment in question. "Leave some for me, would you?" "No," George said, grabbing Terence's wrist firmly. Terence only fought for the sake of decorum. If he forgot that they were bickering over Indian food, it almost felt like George was holding his hand. After a brief and restrained struggle, God forbid one drop of chutney be spilt. The plastic cup was placed by George's plate, and damned if Terence was going to try for it again. The man knew what he was doing with a bit of brotherly messing about. And oh, that was not the kind of thought Terence ought to have been having in the middle of a quiet dinner with a quite clearly uninterested George. In Terence's mind, these dinners were as good as it was going to get. In Terence's mind, these dinners were like playing house. He'd rather not ruin it if it could be helped at all. But because he was Terence Owens, repository of the universe's sexual frustration, it could not be helped. Not at all. The generous and indiscriminating nature of his lust had narrowed to a gallery of pictures taken through Love's pinhole camera. They had constructed pinhole cameras in Boy Scouts, and how one point of light let in a scene was the same way one kind word had allowed for a flood of adoration. George's nose wrinkling in distaste, George's freckles, which he had even on his lips, honest to God, and how was Terence supposed to resist that? George's reading voice, measured and a bit high and perfect, the suede on the elbows of George's tweed sports coats. So Terence was, essentially, fucked. Rather, he wasn't for the first time in a good while, and he harbored no intentions to seek greener pastures. He stabbed at the cauliflower on his plate like Alu Ghabi had written Age of Consent laws. He was fixated. His fantasies had made the glacial transition from those that he's gotten off to as a dirty-minded sophomore, school ties and George's impossibly neat office and the lunch hour, to something almost elderly, George's China as our China, a house and a dog and lazy Sunday sex. Starting out so early with the very important task of sowing his wild oats to needy schoolboys all and sundry was probably why he was thinking about settling down at the ripe old age of 17. It could have been George's fault entirely. Mrs. Owens had called him a role model, a positive influence, and Terence wondered whether all role models weren't just people you wanted to be if you couldn't have them. But something in his quiet sitting room piled up with books contradicted the idea of a seduction, however subtle. Seduction of a minor wasn't logical, read every spine of every volume of the OED. Logic was not a primary concern in Terence's life, the fidgeting boy mused. Stab, stab, stab. Logic was what George was made of, honest, it ran through his goddamn veins. Stab, stab, stab. It wasn't like George would understand or anything. Understand that love isn't fucking logical, stab, or orderly, stab, or even stab, particularly aca-fucking-demic. Terence was out of Alu Ghabi to punish for his ills and sighed. Pass the rice? He asked, voice small and disconsolate enough that George looked up from Charles fucking Dickens, who probably had more of a chance of getting in George's bed than Terence ever would. It was a single bed, anyway, a mute guarantee of perpetual chastity every time Terence glimpsed it through the half-open door. Something wrong? He said, using as a matter of course his good schoolmaster voice, eyebrows suspended in perfect concern. Nothing, Terence muttered, sullen and teenaged. You're just a kid, George said, the second time Terence professed his undying love. Every time it was harder, because every time he was sure that what he had felt before was a pathetic plastic knockoff of emotion, and that what he felt on this go was the real deal, what inspired people to get married and to die and to get themselves sent to Reading jail. Shouting that he was not a fucking child at that particular juncture hadn't been the response most likely to convince George of his uncommon maturity, and indeed it hadn't done so. George had just sighed and poured more tea, had squared his shoulders, and told Terence that if he wanted to, he could add a shot of whiskey. Tea with whiskey was disgusting. Terence hadn't said so. If you're sure, George said. There was a pause. Terence spoke the language of George's conversational gaps at least as well as he spoke French, which wasn't, despite years of classes on the subject, French, not George, as high a recommendation as one could have wished. This one meant, don't tell me that you love me, please, and remember, it's your night for the dishes.